The Pacific afternoon sun filtered through the reinforced glass windows of the San Diego Veterans Rehabilitation Facility, casting long golden shadows across the polished tile floor. Commander Sarah Mitchell sat motionless in her custom titanium wheelchair, positioned in the corner of the recreation room where she could observe everything without drawing attention. Her steel-gray eyes, sharp as a sniper's scope, traced the movements of other patients with the analytical precision that had defined her entire military career. She watched how the nurses moved, the rhythm of their patrols, the rotation of security personnel. Even in this place of healing, she couldn't switch off the operational mindset. It was encoded into her DNA at a level deeper than consciousness. 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days had passed since the IED explosion in the mountains of Kunar Province, Afghanistan. She remembered every detail with crystalline clarity: the sound of the blast, the smell of burning metal and desert earth, the moment she felt her legs go numb. The official military report had declared it a training exercise accident that resulted in unforeseen injuries. That was the sanitized version, the narrative designed for public consumption and bureaucratic filing. The truth was classified above top secret, buried in bunkers that few people on Earth had clearance to access. Sarah had been conducting a black operations extraction mission, recovering a high-value intelligence asset from a Taliban-controlled compound. The operation was supposed to be a standard in-and-out, executed by her 12-person SEAL Team 7 unit. But intelligence had been compromised. Someone had sold information to the enemy, and when Sarah's team rappelled from the helicopter into the compound's courtyard, 200 fighters were waiting. The firefight lasted 43 minutes. 11 of her teammates died. Sarah took 3 rounds, one in her left shoulder, one grazing her ribs, and one that severed her spinal cord between the L3 and L4 vertebrae. By all medical reasoning, she should have died on that mountain, bleeding out into the Afghan dust like so many warriors before her. But Sarah Mitchell had never been good at following expected outcomes. The surgeons at Bagram Air Base had worked for 7 hours to stabilize her. Then came the flight to Germany, the transfer to Bethesda Naval Medical Center, and finally, 18 months of aggressive rehabilitation. Doctors used words like remarkably resilient and exceptional will to live when discussing her recovery. They had no framework for understanding her because she existed outside normal parameters. Most people who suffered spinal cord injuries at her level experienced depression, rage, despair, the natural human response to losing the ability to walk. Sarah felt none of those things. She simply assessed the situation with cold, tactical clarity and adapted. She had lost mobility from the waist down. Her operational days were over. Her career was terminated. The military had no use for a paralyzed commander. These were facts. Sarah accepted facts the way soldiers accept orders, completely and without argument. But if her body was compromised, her mind remained lethal. And in a world of classified operations and covert intelligence work, a sharp mind was sometimes more valuable than legs. The rehabilitation facility had become her temporary duty station. She was assigned here officially for physical therapy and psychological adjustment, though everyone understood she was really here to fade from public view. Former operators who knew too much, who carried classified knowledge in their heads that couldn't be easily retired, sometimes needed to disappear into civilian life. Not prison, not punishment, just strategic removal from visibility. Sarah was here to become a ghost, a memory of military service that Americans could feel good about while moving on with their lives. And she was excellent at being a ghost. The other patients recognized her only as Sarah, a polite, quiet woman who participated in therapy sessions without complaint and spent her free time reading or staring thoughtfully out windows. The staff treated her with the careful sympathy they extended to all long-term residents. There were moments of automatic pity in their eyes, the pity that came from seeing a young woman's body broken and knowing she would never walk again. Sarah didn't correct their assumption that she was devastated. The pity worked in her favor. It made her invisible. What none of them understood was that Sarah's wheelchair wasn't a prison. It was a tactical position. From this seat, she could see the entire facility's security apparatus, the entry and exit routes, the patterns of guard rotations, the blind spots in the surveillance system. She'd mapped the compound's layout during her first week, identified which staff members were competent and which were lazy, noted which nurses had family problems that might make them vulnerable to coercion. Old habits. Her brain couldn't turn them off even if she'd wanted to, which she didn't. Sarah had learned decades ago that operational awareness was the difference between living and dying. You paid attention, or you ended up dead in a mountain pass in Afghanistan. The facility director, Dr. Marcus Reeves, had made several attempts to build a rapport with her. He was genuinely well-meaning, the kind of man who'd chosen to work with traumatized veterans because he actually cared about their recovery. During their one-on-one sessions, he'd asked gentle questions about her feelings, her goals, her plans for civilian life. Sarah had given him the responses he wanted to hear, that she was adjusting, that she found meaning in helping other veterans, that she was exploring vocational rehabilitation opportunities. All lies, of course. But they were the right lies, the ones that allowed Dr. Reeves to feel like his interventions were working, that his facility was successfully integrating another wounded warrior back into society. Sarah had learned long ago that most people weren't interested in truth. They were interested in narratives that made them feel competent and good. Give them those narratives, and they'd leave you alone. She wheeled herself slowly through the facility's hallway, noting that Thompson, one of the security guards, had a new photograph on his desk. A baby, probably born in the last 2 weeks. That meant Thompson was sleep-deprived and running on fumes, his reflexes probably down by 30%. Wilson, the night shift supervisor, had started drinking coffee with trembling hands. Relationship problems, probably. The facility's psychiatric counselor, Dr. Sarah Chen, had started coming in at 6 in the morning instead of her usual 8. New research project, possibly. These details accumulated in Sarah's mind like intelligence briefings, arranged and cross-referenced, building a complete picture of the facility's operational status. Outside the window, the late afternoon sky had turned a brilliant shade of orange. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter passed overhead, a civilian medevac from the sound of it, not military. Sarah watched it disappear into the clouds and felt nothing. No longing, no regret, no sense of what she'd lost. That chapter of her life was closed. She was something new now, still lethal, still dangerous, still capable, but transformed into a shape that no one expected. The other patients would go home eventually, restored to their families, integrated back into civilian life. Some would succeed. Others would struggle with phantom pains, with PTSD, with the existential crisis of being broken in a society that worships wholeness. They would try to find meaning in survival, purpose in recovery. Sarah didn't have that problem. She'd never believed survival was the point. The point was the mission. The point was serving something larger than yourself. The point was excellence. And Commander Sarah Mitchell had never failed at excellence. She turned her wheelchair back toward her room as evening fell over the facility, her steel-gray eyes reflecting the fading light. Tomorrow would bring more observation, more data collection, more invisible preparation. Because somewhere in the classified corridors of Naval Special Operations Command, there were people who knew exactly what Sarah Mitchell was capable of. And sooner or later, they would come looking for her. When they did, she would be ready. The morning had started like any other Wednesday at the San Diego Veterans Rehabilitation Facility. Sarah had attended her physical therapy session at 9 o'clock, where she'd worked with therapist Marcus Johnson on maintaining her upper body strength. The exercises were routine, weights, resistance bands, balance work, performed with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Marcus always commented on her exceptional progress, though he didn't understand that Sarah wasn't working toward the normality he envisioned for her. She was working toward something else entirely, something he lacked the clearance to understand. By noon, she'd returned to her room and settled into her usual afternoon routine, reading classified intelligence briefings that mysteriously arrived in encrypted digital form, analyzing tactical scenarios in her head, and observing the facility's operational patterns from her window. She was midway through a report on emerging drone technology when the first alarm bells sounded. Not literal alarms, but the subtle shift in facility energy that indicated something unusual was happening. The recreation center had been scheduled for a community outreach event that afternoon. A local veterans advocacy group was hosting a discussion panel on military rehabilitation services. Sarah hadn't planned to attend. Public events weren't her preference. But when she heard the commotion escalating in the hallways around 2 o'clock, raised voices, security radios crackling with alert codes, she decided a personal reconnaissance mission was warranted. She wheeled herself silently toward the recreation center, moving with the practiced stealth of someone who'd spent decades learning to disappear in plain sight. What she found was controlled chaos. Approximately 50 protesters had gathered outside the recreation center's main entrance, their presence announced by signs, shouted slogans, and a level of organized aggression that suggested this wasn't spontaneous. Sarah immediately began analyzing the group's composition and tactical organization. She identified a core leadership element, maybe 8 to 10 individuals who were coordinating the others, directing foot traffic, positioning people for maximum visibility. The signs themselves were professionally printed, suggesting funding from an organized advocacy network. The protesters' chants had a rehearsed quality, delivered in synchronized waves that indicated prior training. No more wars, no more lies, soldiers' bodies pay the price. Military-industrial killing machine. Accountability now. Sarah recognized the rhetoric. She'd been briefed on a dozen anti-military activist networks operating along the California coast. These were true believers, the kind of protesters who operated from genuine conviction rather than casual curiosity. That made them both more dangerous and more predictable. Predictable meant she could model their likely behavior patterns. Dangerous meant they might do something reckless in pursuit of their ideological goals. The facility's security team, led by Director Reeves, was attempting to manage the situation with professional calm. They'd closed the main entrance and were directing attendees around to the side entrance. Security personnel were positioned strategically, not aggressive but clearly visible. This was crowd management 101, presence without provocation. It was competent work, though Sarah noted 3 tactical vulnerabilities that would matter if the protest escalated. She positioned her wheelchair near the recreation center's east wall, partially obscured by a potted plant, giving her an unobstructed view of the main action. Her hands rested on the wheelchair's armrests, appearing relaxed, but her muscles were coiled with the kind of readiness that came from 2 decades of military service. She was here to observe, to gather intelligence, to understand the group's true intentions. Part of her was genuinely curious whether this would escalate into actual violence. Part of her hoped it would. A peaceful protest was information gathering. A violent one was an operational test. The afternoon wore on, and the protest maintained its energy level but didn't intensify. Activists chanted, held signs, occasionally blocked entrance paths before being redirected by security. It was irritating to the facility's operations but largely harmless. Sarah was beginning to assess that this was exactly what it appeared to be, an ideological statement without tactical objectives. Then everything changed. A man emerged from the protest's core group, late 20s, intense eyes, the kind of burning conviction that came from true belief rather than casual activism. His name was Derek Monroe, though Sarah wouldn't learn that until later when police reports identified him. What she registered immediately was his behavioral pattern: elevated aggression markers, wide stance indicating aggressive readiness, hand movements that suggested he was working himself towards some kind of action threshold. She'd seen this before. She'd watched men cross the line from peaceful protest into violence. This man was approaching that threshold. Derek's eyes scanned the recreation center's entrance, analyzing entry points and security positions. He was looking for something, an opportunity, a symbol, a moment. Then his gaze locked onto Sarah's position near the wall, and she saw the moment of recognition flash across his face. To him, she wasn't a skilled operative in a wheelchair. She was the perfect symbol. She was a broken soldier, a victim of military violence, a walking, or rather, rolling, indictment of everything he believed the military represented. To him, Sarah represented the human cost of wars he opposed. And if he could physically demonstrate that cost to the cameras and phones recording this event, he could crystallize his message in a way that words never could. Sarah watched him move toward her with the same detached clarity she brought to all tactical situations. There was no fear, no defensiveness, no preparation for resistance. She simply observed his approach, calculated his likely actions, and made a decision that would reshape everything. Derek reached her position in 12 strides. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed with emotional intensity. "You're exactly what this is about," he said, gesturing at her wheelchair with trembling fingers. "The military destroys people like you and then just discards them. That's what we're here to expose." Sarah said nothing. She simply watched him, her steel-gray eyes unreadable. What happened next occurred in 3 seconds, though it would be replayed thousands of times on news broadcasts and social media platforms. Derek grabbed the wheelchair's push handles with both hands. His intention was clearly to overturn it, to create a dramatic image of a disabled veteran being literally discarded. Sarah allowed it. She didn't brace herself, didn't attempt to prevent the motion, didn't resist. She simply released the tension in her body and let gravity and momentum do their work. The wheelchair tipped sideways. Sarah's body fell with it, hitting the tile floor with enough force to create a sharp, audible impact. For a fraction of a second, pain registered, not from the fall, which her body was entirely conditioned to tolerate, but from the pure tactical calculation of what she was allowing to happen. The cameras caught everything. The moment of the wheelchair overturning. The moment of her body hitting the ground. The moment of Derek standing above her, shouting about military accountability, his face twisted with righteous conviction. Security personnel rushed toward her immediately, but Sarah's fall had taken only a second. She was already analyzing the immediate aftermath, the response patterns, the media implications. She could hear phones capturing video, could sense the energy shift in the crowd as they realized what they'd witnessed. This was the moment, the image that would define her in the public consciousness. The symbol that would be transmitted across the country, interpreted 1,000 different ways, transformed into a narrative about wounded veterans and systemic neglect. Derek Monroe was pulled away by security, still shouting, still convinced he was exposing injustice. Dr. Reeves knelt beside Sarah, his face pale with concern. "Sarah, are you hurt? Can you move? We're calling an ambulance." Sarah looked up at him from the floor, her expression perfectly calibrated to suggest shock and pain while her mind remained completely clear. "I'm okay," she said softly, her voice trembling with artificial distress. "I'm okay, just help me up." But in her mind, in the locked chambers of her operational consciousness, she was already 3 steps ahead. She understood what this moment would become. She understood its power. And she understood that she had just set something in motion that would eventually pull her back into the world she was supposed to have left behind. The wheelchair was righted. She was helped back into it. An ambulance was called. And as she was wheeled toward the medical examination area, Sarah Mitchell's carefully constructed ghost of anonymity began its inevitable transformation into legend. The video went viral at 3:47 p.m. Pacific Time on a Wednesday afternoon in March. By 4:15 p.m., it had been viewed 1.2 million times. By 6:00 p.m., it had been shared across every major social media platform. By midnight, it had eclipsed 47 million views, and the number was growing exponentially every minute. The angle was perfect. taken from a phone held by a facility visitor who'd captured Derek Monroe's assault from start to finish in crystal clear HD. The moment of the wheelchair tipping, the moment of Sarah's body hitting the tile floor, the moment of Derek standing above her with his face twisted in self-righteous anger. It was the kind of footage that didn't need interpretation. It told a story that Americans already understood. Yet another wounded veteran, vulnerable and alone, being brutalized by people who didn't respect their sacrifice. The narrative assembled itself with remarkable speed. By Thursday morning, every major news outlet had run the story. CNN led with disabled veteran assaulted at San Diego facility. Fox News framed it as anti-American protesters attack wounded hero. MSNBC contextualized it within broader conversations about veteran support and social division. The New York Times ran an investigative-style headline, "Inside the San Diego facility, what happened when activism turned violent?" Within 18 hours, the story had transcended news coverage and become a cultural moment. Politicians immediately seized the opportunity to demonstrate their patriotism. Senator James Mitchell, no relation to Sarah, though the coincidence wasn't lost on observers, appeared on 3 morning shows before 9:00 a.m. Friday, calling for federal charges against Derek Monroe and demanding a comprehensive investigation into security at Veterans Affairs facilities nationwide. Representative Maria Garcia released a statement pledging to introduce legislation increasing security funding for rehabilitation centers. The president's press secretary issued a formal statement expressing outrage at the assault and promising swift justice. Every political figure in America suddenly understood that this issue was a winner. Patriotism was a safe bet, and defending wounded veterans gave them moral high ground that couldn't be challenged without appearing callous. Sarah Mitchell, the woman at the center of the storm, remained silent. She lay in the facility's medical wing, officially under observation for potential spinal complications from the fall, though the medical staff found nothing physically wrong with her beyond minor bruising. She gave no interviews. She made no public statements. When visitors occasionally appeared, local news reporters, activists offering solidarity, concerned citizens bearing flowers, the facility's administration graciously but firmly declined on her behalf. Commander Mitchell is still processing the traumatic incident, Dr. Reeves explained to journalists. We're prioritizing her psychological recovery and privacy during this difficult time. The use of her military rank was accidental, but it added a layer of credibility to the narrative. She wasn't just a patient, she was a commander. She wasn't just injured, she was traumatized. The public constructed an increasingly elaborate mythology around Sarah in her absence. Online communities debated her psychological state, her rehabilitation prospects, her future quality of life. Women's groups claimed her as a symbol of systemic abuse. Military advocacy organizations held candle-lit vigils outside the facility. A GoFundMe page that someone created in her name raised $2.1 million in the first 72 hours, intended for her recovery and future care. The money sat in a trust account, untouched, accumulating interest. From her hospital bed, Sarah consumed all of this data with the same analytical precision she'd applied to tactical briefings for 20 years. She'd requested internet access to monitor news coverage, ostensibly to understand the public response to the incident. In reality, she was conducting a masterclass in narrative construction. She watched how different demographic groups interpreted the video differently. She noted which outlets emphasized her disability and vulnerability versus those that highlighted her military service. She analyzed the psychology of the outrage, understanding exactly which emotional triggers were firing in the public consciousness. This was the beautiful mathematics of modern media. Feed the right images to the right audience, and they would construct exactly the narrative you wanted them to construct. The irony was that they were completely correct. She was a decorated military officer. She had been assaulted. She was a symbol of something important. They just didn't understand the full context, that none of this was accident, that every element of this narrative had been carefully choreographed by the woman lying in the hospital bed, her expression perfectly calibrated to suggest pained stoicism. On Friday morning, she received a visitor that the facility's logs would later show never officially existed. Admiral James Blackwell, head of Naval Special Operations Command, arrived in a nondescript sedan at 5:45 a.m. before facility staff rotations changed. He was escorted directly to Sarah's private room by Dr. Reeves, who'd been given a single phone call and asked not to ask questions. Blackwell was a compact man in his early 60s, with the bearing of someone who'd made hard decisions in hard places and lived with the consequences. He stood at the window for 30 seconds without speaking, watching the facility's grounds begin to awaken with morning light. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational. "That was beautifully executed," he said. "I've read your operational file, every classified report. I've seen your tactical analyses, your mission reports, your psychological evaluations. But watching you in real time, watching you orchestrate that entire incident down to the specific angle of the camera capturing your fall, that was something else entirely." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, her expression neutral. "You let him throw you," Blackwell continued. "You calculated exactly how he would react, exactly what the cameras would capture, exactly how the public would interpret it. You created a symbol. You made yourself invisible in plain sight by becoming the most visible person in the country." He turned to face her. "The question is, why?" Sarah's response was measured and precise. "Because," she said, "I needed to disappear completely before anyone could ask me back to work. And the only way to disappear completely is to become exactly what everyone expects to see: a broken veteran, a victim, someone the public wants to protect, not someone they're afraid of." Blackwell nodded slowly. "We have a problem," he said, and proceeded to explain about the 4 captured intelligence operatives in Yemen, the 72-hour timeline, the impossible extraction, and the reason he'd come to see a wheelchair-bound commander in a rehabilitation facility at 5:45 in the morning. He didn't ask if she was capable. He didn't suggest she reconsider her retirement. He simply laid out the facts and waited. Sarah listened to every word, her mind already mapping operational parameters, tactical approaches, resource requirements. Somewhere deep in her chest, beneath layers of professional discipline and calculated emotion, something awakened. It was the thing she'd been trying to suppress for 3 years: the hunger for operation, the need for mission, the fundamental recognition that she was built for exactly this kind of work. "I'll need a secure facility for training," Sarah said quietly. "Equipment modified for my wheelchair configuration. A team I can evaluate and trust. And authorization from the highest levels of government, because what we'd be attempting violates about a dozen different protocols." Blackwell smiled slightly. 72 hours, Commander Mitchell, that's all you have." As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him. "Tell them I'm devastated. Tell them I'm struggling. Tell them I'm grateful for all the support. Make them believe I'm broken beyond repair." "Already done," Blackwell said. "The narrative is perfect. America's broken hero, slowly recovering with the nation's prayers. They'll believe whatever we want them to believe because that's what they came to see." As dawnlight filled the hospital room, Sarah Mitchell lay back in her bed and felt something like satisfaction. The game had begun. The real operation was hours away. And for the first time in 3 years, she knew exactly who she was supposed to be. The safe house was located in the desert outside Barstow, California, approximately 200 miles north of the rehabilitation facility. Sarah had been transported there in the back of an unmarked government van at 2:00 a.m. on Saturday morning, smuggled out of the facility with surgical precision. Dr. Reeves had been paid a visit by 2 men in dark suits who explained, without explicitly threatening, that Sarah Mitchell's medical records would show she'd requested a temporary transfer to a more specialized rehabilitation facility upstate. The paperwork was already prepared. The documentation was already in place. His cooperation wasn't really being requested. It was being assured. The safe house itself was architecturally nondescript, a low-slung concrete structure surrounded by 10 acres of desert scrub, accessible only by a private road that wasn't on any publicly available maps. Inside, the facility was nothing short of extraordinary. State-of-the-art medical equipment lined the walls of what had been converted into a tactical operations center. High-speed internet connections tied directly to classified military networks, satellite imagery systems, tactical planning stations, and in the back section, something that made Sarah's pulse quicken, a fully equipped adaptive combat training facility. Admiral Blackwell was waiting for her in the main briefing room, along with 5 other people whose presence indicated the highest levels of classified authorization. There was Lieutenant Commander David Torres, Operations Chief for Naval Special Operations Command, a man whose file Sarah knew contained details of 17 successful Black Ops missions. Captain Linda Zhang, head of Naval Intelligence Analysis, who'd earned her reputation by being right about geopolitical situations that everyone else got wrong. Major James Whitfield from the Joint Special Operations Command, a tactical genius who'd redesigned modern close-quarters combat doctrine. And 2 people whose identities weren't even mentioned, a man and a woman who sat in the back and didn't speak, their presence alone suggesting they represented agencies even more classified than SEAL team operations. "Sit down, Commander," Blackwell said, gesturing to the wheelchair-accessible position at the briefing table that had obviously been prepared in advance. Every detail had been choreographed. Every element of the operation was already being managed with precise military efficiency. "I need to brief you on something that requires clearance above your current authorization level. In about 30 seconds, you're going to learn information that will make you a target of approximately 7 different foreign intelligence services. Once you hear it, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to the facility. You can't return to civilian life. You're either all in, or we tranquilize you and deposit you in a hospital in Reno with amnesia from the assault. Your choice." Sarah didn't hesitate. "Brief me," she said. Blackwell nodded to Captain Zhang, who activated a satellite imagery display on the screen. The image showed a compound in Yemen's Hadramaut Governorate, a remote area controlled by a terrorist organization with loose ties to Iranian intelligence services. 4 days ago, Zhang explained, a CIA intelligence gathering team was compromised during an operation in Sana'a. The compromise was systematic and complete. Someone inside the agency fed detailed intelligence to the target organization about team movements, safe house locations, operational procedures. The team was captured, all 4 operatives. The image zoomed in, showing a fortified compound with high walls, guard towers, and what appeared to be a central detention block. The terrorists have demanded a prisoner exchange, 4 operatives they're holding in other locations, all of whom are currently detained at maximum security facilities within the United States. Congress won't approve the exchange. The president won't authorize it. These 4 CIA officers are officially being written off as operational losses. Unofficially, Blackwell continued, we're not accepting that. These are people who have spent their careers acquiring intelligence that keeps Americans alive. We don't abandon them. We extract them. And we have 72 hours before the terrorist cell executes them on video broadcast to the world. Lieutenant Commander Torres brought up a new set of images, drone footage of the compound's exterior, internal layouts created from satellite imagery and human intelligence, guard rotation patterns analyzed from 3 weeks of surveillance data. Conventional extraction is impossible, Torres explained. The location is surrounded by hostile territory. Any helicopter insertion is shot down. Any ground approach is detected. The terrorist cell has invested significant resources into making this facility impregnable to military intervention. They've done extensive counter-surveillance work, studied how America responds to hostage situations, positioned assets to counter every standard tactical approach. Tours paused, letting the weight of the situation settle. Which is why we're going to do something they won't expect, something that violates every assumption they've made about American military capabilities. Major Whitfield stepped forward, his expression businesslike. We're sending in a one-person operative with a specialized tactical approach that takes advantage of vulnerabilities in their security protocols. Someone who can move through that compound with capabilities they won't recognize until it's too late. Someone who is, for all intents and purposes, invisible to their threat assessment models. He brought up a new image, a detailed schematic of the compound's interior, marked with what appeared to be a planned route through the facility. The detention block is secured by 2 heavy steel doors, electronic locks, and 6 guards in rotating shifts. A standard entry team would trigger alarms, initiate hostage execution protocols, and result in all 4 operatives being killed within minutes. But if we can get someone inside the perimeter, someone who can navigate silently through the compound's maintenance tunnels and access points, someone who is trained in non-lethal takedowns and can operate independently without external support, we might have a possibility of success. Sarah watched the schematic update, watched as the planned route indicated movement through service corridors, electrical conduits, and maintenance access points that most soldiers wouldn't even recognize as viable pathways. She understood what they were proposing. She understood the extreme difficulty level, the near-impossible tactical requirements, the massive operational risk. She also understood exactly why they needed her. "You're going to ask me to do this in a wheelchair," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Not in a wheelchair," Blackwell corrected. "In modified tactical equipment designed specifically for your enhanced mobility requirements. The wheelchair is for public consumption. What we've developed, what's in the facility behind us, is something else entirely. It's not a disability accommodation. It's a tactical advantage." For the next 4 hours, they briefed her on every aspect of the operation. The weather patterns in Yemen, the guard rotation schedules, the psychological profiles of the terrorist cell's leadership, which indicated they followed predictable patterns of behavior at specific times of day. The technical specifications of the electronic locks, which had a known vulnerability if accessed from the internal circuit panel rather than externally defeated. The intelligence on the captured operatives, their names, their backgrounds, their families, the reason they mattered enough to risk this impossible extraction. The primary captured operative was Dr. James Richardson, a CIA analyst who'd spent 15 years building intelligence networks in the Middle East. His wife was a pediatrician. They had 2 children. The second operative was Sarah Chen, no relation to the facility's psychiatrist, a signals intelligence specialist with an eidetic memory for complex patterns. The third was Marcus Walker, a former Navy SEAL turned intelligence officer who'd voluntarily left the teams to pursue intelligence work. And the fourth was Elena Vasquez, a linguistic specialist who could identify regional dialects and communication patterns with uncanny accuracy. "These people matter," Blackwell said simply. "And more than that, what's happening here, the systematic compromise of our intelligence infrastructure, suggests a mole at the highest levels of the CIA. Someone is feeding operational intelligence to hostile foreign actors. Someone inside the agency is working against us. These 4 operatives might have information about who that mole is. We need them alive to interrogate. We need them alive to maintain operational continuity. And we need to send a message that America doesn't abandon its people, no matter how difficult the extraction becomes." Sarah absorbed every detail, her mind cataloging information, building operational models, identifying contingencies. The tactical problem was genuinely complex. The risk was genuinely massive. The likelihood of success, by conventional military assessment standards, was somewhere below 5%. Most operators told these odds would acknowledge the impossibility of the task. Sarah Mitchell simply said, "When do we start training?" "Now," Blackwell replied. "You have 72 hours to master equipment you've never seen before, develop a mission plan that violates every conventional tactical doctrine, train with a team that doesn't exist and will disappear after this operation, and prepare yourself psychologically for an extraction attempt that might very well be the last thing you do before dying in a Yemeni desert. The tactical team is waiting in the training facility. The equipment is there. The intelligence packets are ready. You'll sleep when the mission is complete or when you're dead. Those are the only two options available." Sarah wheeled herself toward the back of the facility, toward the training area where her resurrection was waiting. As she moved, she felt something that 3 years of rehabilitation had suppressed, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Everything in her life had been leading to this moment. The injury, the retirement, the carefully maintained anonymity, the orchestrated assault that had made her disappear into public mythology. It had all been preparation for this single 72-hour window, where she would become the operative that America's enemies couldn't even imagine facing. Behind her, Admiral Blackwell watched her disappear into the training facility and allowed himself a small smile. They'd made the right choice recalling her. Whatever doubts he might have harbored about using a disabled operator were about to be completely vindicated. By the time Sarah Mitchell was finished with this operation, the entire landscape of modern special operations would have fundamentally shifted. The tactical equipment didn't look like a wheelchair. That was the first thing that became apparent when Sarah entered the equipment laboratory at 300 hours on Saturday morning. What it resembled instead was a hybrid between a high-end mobility system and a piece of advanced military hardware. The frame was constructed from carbon fiber and titanium alloys, lighter than traditional wheelchairs but infinitely stronger. The wheels were oversized, designed for rapid propulsion across varied terrain, desert sand, rocky outcrops, smooth concrete floors. But the real engineering was in the system's technical specifications. The chair integrated advanced sensor arrays that fed real-time environmental data to a heads-up display mounted inside the modified helmet Sarah would wear. Thermal imaging capability, night vision integration, distance measurement systems. The chair's propulsion system used electromagnetic motors that were nearly silent, allowing for movement through tactical environments without acoustic signature. And beneath the seat, integrated weapon mounting systems could accommodate specialized firearms configured for operation while seated. "We've been developing this system for 5 years," explained Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, the lead engineer on the adaptive warfare project. She was a woman in her mid-50s with the bearing of someone who'd spent her entire career solving problems that military procurement officials insisted were impossible. Every piece of adaptive equipment that existed before was designed to accommodate disability, to help disabled people function in a world designed for able-bodied people. This is different. This is equipment designed around the reality that a disabled operator might have specific advantages that we're not utilizing because we're thinking about disability as limitation rather than transformation. Sarah spent 3 hours learning the technical specifications, the weapon integration systems, the sensor interfaces, the propulsion controls. She understood immediately that this wasn't just equipment. It was an extension of her operational capability, integrated so seamlessly that it would become part of her body's sensory apparatus within hours of use. Dr. Okonkwo explained the theory behind haptic feedback systems, how vibrations through the chair's frame would communicate environmental data directly to her nervous system, allowing her to sense things: proximity to obstacles, thermal signatures of personnel, changes in terrain elevation, without conscious processing. By 600 hours, Sarah was in the equipment testing bay, learning to move through the chair with the efficiency that would define her operational capability. The bay was constructed to simulate the compound in Yemen, similar wall heights, similar door configurations, similar spacing between obstacles. She pushed herself forward, feeling the chair respond with absolute precision. The electromagnetic motors provided perfect torque control. The wheels gripped surfaces with exceptional traction. And as she moved, the sensor data began populating in her visual field, layers of information overlaying physical reality. The tactical team began arriving at 700 hours. 12 operators from SEAL Team 7, all of them combat-hardened veterans who'd served alongside Sarah in previous operations. Marcus Reaper Sullivan was the senior enlisted, a man who'd been on the Afghanistan operation where Sarah was injured. He'd watched her get hit, had carried her to the extraction helicopter, had held her in his arms as the bird lifted away from that mountain. Looking at him now, seeing the skepticism flicker across his face when he realized Sarah would be leading this operation, Sarah understood what needed to happen. Physical contest, she said without preamble. Hand-to-hand combat simulation. You, me, no weapons. Best 2 of 3. If you win, I step aside and Blackwell finds someone else to lead this operation. If I win, you trust my operational decisions completely for the next 72 hours without question or hesitation. Marcus was silent for a moment, then nodded. The other operators gathered around the practice mat, watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed doubt. Sarah wheeled herself to the center of the mat. Marcus approached, moving with the careful deliberation of a man trying to predict an opponent's capabilities, while knowing almost nothing about how they'd adapted to their injury. What happened in the next 90 seconds changed everything. Sarah moved with explosive power that none of the operators had anticipated. From her seated position, she generated momentum by pushing herself upward in a controlled rotation, using the chair's design as part of her tactical apparatus. Marcus attempted a takedown that would have worked against most stationary opponents. Instead, Sarah pivoted the chair with perfect precision, using her upper body strength, which had increased exponentially during 3 years of focused rehabilitation, to redirect his momentum. He hit the mat hard. Round 2 went slightly longer, with Marcus employing a different strategy, but the outcome remained identical. Sarah's adapted physiology, combined with equipment designed specifically for combat applications, generated tactical advantages that conventional martial arts training had never accounted for. By the end of the second contest, Marcus was breathing heavily, nursing a bruised shoulder, and had a completely different expression on his face. "What do you need?" he asked. Over the next 68 hours, Sarah's team evolved from skeptics into operatives who understood they were working with someone fundamentally exceptional. They trained continuously, equipment configurations, insertion techniques, tactical movements through simulated compound environments. Sarah demonstrated proficiency with weapons systems that most operators required months to master. She could disassemble and reassemble a modified AR-15 while moving at full speed through an obstacle course. She could calculate ballistic trajectories while navigating varied terrain. She could identify threat signatures in satellite imagery that even trained intelligence analysts initially missed. By Sunday evening, the tactical team had moved beyond acceptance into genuine respect. They watched her execute a perfect tactical breach through a simulated door, watched her navigate through the complex three-dimensional space of the simulated compound, watched her maintain combat effectiveness while managing multiple simultaneous threat assessments. One operator, a younger guy named Jackson, whispered to Marcus after observing her execute a perfect non-lethal takedown simulation. "She's not adapted to combat. Combat is adapted to her." The psychological component of the training was equally intense. Sarah spent hours in debriefing sessions with Captain Zhang, analyzing the psychology of the terrorist cell's leadership, understanding their likely decision-making processes, predicting how they would respond to unexpected situations. She studied the profiles of the 4 captured operatives, understanding their backgrounds, their training, their psychological breaking points. She needed to know these people's minds as well as their locations, because successful extraction wasn't just about physical capability. It was about understanding human behavior under extreme stress. By Monday morning, 72 hours remained. Sarah had consumed approximately 6 hours of sleep total, supplemented with stimulant injections that kept her neurological systems operating at peak efficiency despite the accumulating fatigue. She was thinner than she'd been on Saturday, her body burning calories at an extraordinary rate as she pushed every system to its limits. Her hands showed minor cuts and abrasions from weapons training. Her muscles ached with the deep burn of exertion that approached her physical ceiling. And she had never felt more alive. In the final briefing, Admiral Blackwell presented the operation's final parameters. The terrorist cell is executing the first hostage at 400 hours on Thursday local time. That's 34 hours from now. You'll be deployed via transport aircraft to a forward staging area in Oman. From there, you'll conduct a final 4-hour transit to the extraction point. You'll have a 7-hour window to infiltrate the compound, locate the 4 operatives, neutralize security threats without triggering alarm systems, extract the hostages, and reach the extraction helicopter. Any deviation from timeline results in mission failure and loss of American personnel. He paused, letting the weight of responsibility settle onto Sarah's shoulders. You're the most qualified operative we have for this mission. You're also the operator that our enemies will never anticipate. They're looking for conventional SEAL insertions. They're expecting helicopter assaults. They're preparing defenses against strategies that have been used in the past. They will never imagine that the threat to their security will come from a disabled operative in equipment they don't understand, moving through tactical spaces they didn't even know were accessible. Your advantage, Blackwell concluded, is their blindness. Use it. Sarah wheeled herself out of the briefing room toward the equipment preparation bay. The tactical team was already there, performing final weapons checks, testing communication systems, verifying that every piece of equipment would function flawlessly in the Yemeni desert. She looked at the faces around her, the operators who'd gone from skepticism to absolute faith in her capability. She looked at the specialized equipment that represented 5 years of advanced military engineering. She looked at the intelligence packages containing detailed information about the compound, the guards, the hostages, the timing. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. Everything came down to the next 34 hours. Sarah Mitchell closed her eyes and felt something ancient activate in her consciousness. Not fear, not doubt, not hesitation, but absolute operational clarity. She'd been built for moments like this. She'd been trained for decades to function at the intersection of impossible odds and extraordinary capability. Her disability wasn't a limitation she'd overcome. It was a transformation that had made her capable of something no fully able operator could accomplish. The resurrection was complete. The Yemeni desert was a study in extremes, scorching heat during daylight hours that could kill a person through dehydration alone, then bitter cold during the night that froze exposed skin. Sarah had experienced both during the transit from Oman, positioned in the cargo hold of a modified MV-22 Osprey that flew low enough to avoid radar detection, while high enough to minimize the risk of ground fire. The 12 operators of her team were arranged around her in tactical formation, each man checking weapons systems and communication gear with the methodical precision of professionals who understood that inattention meant death. The landing zone was a flat stretch of desert approximately 3 kilometers from the target compound. The Osprey set down with minimal dust signature, and Sarah's team moved with practiced efficiency, establishing a perimeter while she conducted final equipment checks. The specialized tactical wheelchair had been loaded last, cushioned against the aircraft's vibrations. Sarah transferred into it smoothly, feeling the electromagnetic system's power up as her weight settled onto the seat. The heads-up display activated, overlaying thermal and visual data across her field of vision. The temperature was 41 degrees Celsius. Winds were negligible. Thermal signatures of the compound were exactly where intelligence projections had indicated they would be. Sarah conducted a final radio check with the team, verifying that all 12 operators were reading her as command authority. There was no hesitation in their responses. In 72 hours, they'd gone from skepticism to absolute faith. "Moving out," Sarah commanded quietly. "Navigation Protocol Delta, maintain spacing, watch for ground signatures, stay on comms." The journey to the compound took 47 minutes across terrain that would have been nearly impassable for conventional personnel. Sarah's modified wheelchair handled the variation expertly. The oversized wheels gripped sand, navigated rocky outcrops, climbed subtle elevation changes that would have stopped standard equipment dead. The other operators moved alongside her, covering her flanks, watching for threats that might emerge from the darkness. Behind them, a secondary team provided overwatch from the staging area, maintaining satellite communications and ready to provide fire support if the insertion went hot. The compound appeared as a darker shadow against the star-scattered desert sky. High concrete walls, guard towers at 4 corners, access points limited to 2 primary gates plus maintenance entrances that satellite imagery had identified but ground-level surveillance hadn't confirmed. Sarah signaled the team to hold position 50 meters out, and she began conducting a detailed sensor analysis of the facility's current security status. The thermal imaging showed exactly 8 guards in predictable positions, 4 on the main gates, 2 in the eastern tower, 2 rotating on the north wall. Electronic surveillance systems showed standard camera placement with rotation patterns that indicated the equipment was functional but not sophisticated. No motion sensors, no pressure-sensitive triggers, no sophisticated electronic alarm systems beyond basic perimeter monitoring. The terrorist cell had invested in visible security rather than technical defense systems, a tactical decision that suggested they'd never actually faced a coordinated military extraction attempt. Sarah's advantage was absolute. "Breach point," she whispered into the radio, directing the team's attention to the maintenance access point on the eastern wall. It was a metal grate designed to allow water drainage from the facility's interior courtyard, secured with a basic padlock rather than sophisticated electronic mechanisms. 3 operators moved forward with precision tools, and the lock was disabled in 47 seconds without triggering any alarm system. What happened next was executed so smoothly that it would later appear choreographed in the security footage the terrorist cell would eventually release. Sarah wheeled herself toward the main entrance, deliberately visible to the 2 guards manning that position. The moment they spotted her, the moment confusion registered on their faces as they tried to comprehend what a disabled woman in a wheelchair was doing in the middle of the Yemen desert, the Eastern assault team moved. The first 2 guards never fired a weapon. Sarah's operators used specialized non-lethal projectiles, compressed air systems that delivered incapacitating doses without generating gunfire acoustics that would alert other security personnel. The guards dropped silently. The maintenance grate was pulled open. The assault team disappeared into the facility's maintenance tunnel system before the guards' bodies had stopped moving. Sarah maintained her position at the main entrance, visible and commanding authority, her presence serving as psychological disruption to the remaining guards. When the northern wall guard attempted to radio an alert, his voice simply cut off mid-transmission. Sarah's electronic warfare specialist had isolated the communications frequency and jammed the outgoing signal. The guard would keep trying to communicate for exactly 8 seconds before realizing something was wrong. By then, it would be too late. Inside the compound, the assault team moved through the maintenance tunnels with Sarah's real-time guidance. She maintained continuous satellite communications with the tactical center in Barstow, receiving updated intelligence on guard movements, pressure-tested the facility's internal security systems through her adaptive equipment's signal analysis capabilities, and provided moment-by-moment tactical updates to the team moving through the facility's interior. The level of situational awareness she possessed was unprecedented. She could see through walls using thermal imaging, could predict guard movements based on behavioral analysis, could identify the precise location of the detention block based on human intelligence combined with physical structure analysis. Detention block entry point, 60 meters, bearing 270, Sarah transmitted. Guard rotation pattern indicates 10-minute window. 1 operator remains here. 2 assault the electrical control panel. Remaining operators secure the detention cells. The team moved exactly as she directed. The electrical control panel was accessed through a service crawlspace. The electronic lock system was disabled from the internal circuit board rather than externally defeated, preventing any triggered alarms. The detention block door opened silently. Dr. James Richardson was in the first cell, weakened by 5 days of captivity but still conscious. Sarah Chen was in the second, her physical condition better than expected. Marcus Walker and Alina Vasquez were in cells 3 and 4. The operators moved with practiced efficiency, assessing physical condition, providing water and basic medical support, preparing the hostages for rapid extraction. The facility's response came exactly as Sarah had predicted. With communication systems jammed, the guards began a systematic search of the compound's interior. This was their critical mistake. They were looking for conventional threats, heavily armed assault teams, explosives, military hardware. What they encountered instead was Sarah Mitchell positioned at the main entrance, visible and alone, firing precise shots that incapacitated guards without triggering the lethal force escalation that would have resulted in hostage execution. 3 guards came at her from the main courtyard. Sarah's weapon system was integrated into the wheelchair's firing mechanism, allowing her to engage targets while maintaining full mobility control. She fired 3 times. 3 guards dropped, incapacitated by specialized projectiles that would leave no permanent injury but would render them unconscious for the next 8 hours. Behind her, the assault team was moving the rescued hostages through the facility's maintenance system toward the compound's eastern wall. The helicopter extraction point was 2 kilometers away. Sarah's team had 30 minutes to get the hostages mobile and moving across open desert before the terrorist cell could mount a coordinated response. The 2 guards at the maintenance grate had regained partial consciousness, but were still incapacitated. Sarah provided covering fire as the assault team emerged from the facility. The 4 hostages moving between protective operators, moving faster than their physical condition should have allowed because the alternative was death. The specialized tactical wheelchair proved invaluable during the extraction. Sarah maintained rear position, providing covering fire while the team moved toward the extraction point. Her integrated weapon systems allowed her to engage pursuing guards while still maintaining forward mobility. The terrorist cell's response was desperate and disorganized. They'd never trained for this scenario because they'd never imagined anyone would attempt an extraction in this manner. By the time the Osprey's rotors appeared on the horizon, the tactical team had traveled 2 kilometers, and the hostages were moving under their own power, running toward the helicopter with the absolute desperation of people who'd expected to die. The terrorist cell had lost 8 personnel to non-lethal incapacitation and had no comprehension of what had happened. Their security systems remained mysteriously non-functional. Their guards lay scattered throughout the compound, conscious but unable to move. Their intelligence asset, the 4 Americans they'd intended to execute, were gone. Sarah was the last to board the Osprey, providing overwatch as the aircraft powered up. The moment her wheels cleared the ramp, the helicopter began its ascent, climbing rapidly away from pursuing fire that came too late to matter. As the compound fell away beneath them and the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, Sarah finally allowed herself a single moment of absolute clarity. The operation had succeeded beyond every projection. The impossible extraction was complete. The classified documents began appearing on secure government networks at 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday morning. Someone inside the Pentagon had made a deliberate choice to leak information that was marked above top secret. Operational details about the Yemen extraction, tactical specifications for the modified equipment, after-action reports filed by Admiral Blackwell regarding the mission's success, and most critically, the name and service record of the operative who'd led the extraction. Commander Sarah Mitchell, United States Navy SEAL Team 7. Within 45 minutes, the first news outlet received a package containing printed copies of these documents, along with a detailed explanation of what they contained. The source remained anonymous, but the motivation was clear. The American public deserved to know who had orchestrated the impossible extraction of 4 intelligence operatives from hostile territory. The American people deserved to understand that the woman they'd watched being brutalized on video was not a helpless victim, but one of the most accomplished military operators alive. By 7:32 a.m., the story had broken across every major news platform simultaneously. CNN interrupted regular programming with a banner headline, "Disabled Navy SEAL Commander LEAD's Daring Hostage Extraction." Fox News framed it as "Hero Operative Proves Military Excellence Transcends Physical Limitations." MSNBC ran the Sarah Mitchell story, from wheelchair assault to classified operation. International news outlets picked it up within minutes. The BBC led with "American Special Forces Commander Executes High-Risk Rescue Mission." The story had transcended national news and become a global phenomenon. The narrative inverted completely in less than an hour. The woman who had been portrayed as a defenseless victim was now revealed as a legendary operative. The assault that had seemed like an act of injustice was recontextualized as an attack on a highly trained soldier who deliberately submitted to it. The facility where she'd been recovering was suddenly recognized as housing one of America's most classified military assets. And Derek Monroe, the activist who'd thrown her from her wheelchair, suddenly found himself not as a courageous whistleblower, but as the man who'd assaulted a decorated Navy commander. Derek's arrest came at 9:15 a.m., just over 2 hours after the story broke. Federal agents arrived at his apartment with warrants charging him with assault on a federal officer, battery against a military servicewoman, and a dozen other federal offenses. The charges carried potential prison sentences exceeding 15 years. As he was led from his apartment in handcuffs, flanked by federal agents, cameras captured his shocked expression. The moment reality collided with his ideological convictions. He'd believed he was exposing injustice. He discovered instead that he'd assaulted someone far more dangerous and accomplished than he'd ever comprehended. The activist community that had supported him experienced immediate fragmentation. Some attempted to maintain that his political message was still valid, that his methods had simply been misguided. Others abandoned him entirely, recognizing that association with someone who'd assaulted a decorated military officer was politically toxic. The protest groups that had emerged to support the facility's closure and military accountability suddenly found their moral framework shattered. How could you protest military violence when the soldier you'd attacked had just risked her life to rescue 4 Americans from terrorist captivity? Admiral Blackwell appeared before Congress at 11:30 a.m., having been authorized by the President to brief key committee members on the operation's classified details. He presented a 30-minute overview that included satellite imagery of the compound, tactical specifications of the operation, post-extraction intelligence briefings, and a detailed explanation of Sarah's role as mission commander. The committee members, who'd been receiving briefings about Sarah's injury 3 years earlier, who'd understood her career was permanently terminated, suddenly confronted a new reality. She wasn't a tragic casualty. She was a weapons system that had been specifically designed to accomplish something that conventional military doctrine couldn't achieve. Senator Richard Hayes, head of the Armed Services Committee, made a statement at 1:00 p.m. Commander Mitchell's operation represents the future of American military capability. This committee will be conducting a comprehensive review of adaptive warfare programs to understand how we can better utilize the exceptional talents of our wounded warriors. This is not just a story of individual heroism. This is the story of how America transforms adversity into advantage. At the San Diego Veterans Rehabilitation Facility, Dr. Marcus Reeves experienced a moment of absolute clarity. The woman he'd been treating as a trauma victim, attempting to help process psychological wounds, had been leading a classified military operation from his facility the entire time. The privacy he'd maintained, the quiet dignity he'd attributed to her trauma processing, none of it had been what he believed it to be. He'd been inadvertently housing a classified military asset without even knowing it. The facility's security had been compromised in ways that would require investigation from multiple intelligence agencies, and his own role in Sarah's recovery was about to be thoroughly reviewed by people who asked very uncomfortable questions. International reactions ranged from skepticism to grudging respect. Russian intelligence analysts acknowledged in classified briefings that American special operations capabilities had apparently exceeded their previous assessments. Chinese military strategists recognized that adaptive warfare programs suggested a fundamental shift in how the U.S. might approach future conflicts. Middle Eastern intelligence services that had been affiliated with the terrorist cell simply disappeared from communication networks, their entire operational structure compromised by Sarah's successful extraction. The terrorist cell that had held the hostages experienced complete organizational collapse. The 4 Americans they'd intended to execute were being debriefed by CIA interrogators, providing detailed intelligence about the cell's leadership, funding sources, international connections, and operational procedures. The cell's commander issued a video statement claiming the extraction was an American propaganda operation, that the hostages had been liberated Americans rather than captured intelligence operatives. The statement convinced no one. The tactical reality was clear. America's military capability had proven superior, a disabled operative had led the operation, and the terrorist organization's security protocols had been thoroughly defeated. By 3:00 p.m. Thursday, nearly 9 hours after the initial leak, the story had fundamentally reshaped American discourse around military disability. News outlets that had run sympathetic profiles of Sarah as a tragic victim now ran profiles of Sarah as a legendary operative. Talk show hosts that had expressed outrage at her treatment now discussed the philosophical implications of her capabilities. Military analysts debated whether adaptive warfare represented the future of special operations, or whether Sarah Mitchell was simply an exceptional individual whose circumstances created an extraordinary narrative. The most powerful moment came at 5:30 p.m. Thursday, when the White House released a statement from the president. Commander Sarah Mitchell represents everything America values: courage, dedication, excellence, and the absolute refusal to accept limitations imposed by circumstance. She has demonstrated that capability is not defined by physical ability, but by the quality of mind, character, and determination that an individual brings to their service. The nation owes her a debt of gratitude that cannot be fully expressed in words. Sarah watched all of this from the tactical medical facility in Oman, where she'd been transported for post-operation medical evaluation. She experienced none of the shock or distress that observers might have anticipated. The leak had been authorized, a calculated decision made by people within the Pentagon who understood that public knowledge of her capabilities would ultimately serve America's strategic interests. The narrative inversion from victim to legend had been predicted, modeled, and strategically managed. What she felt instead was absolute clarity about what came next. The public now knew she existed. The world now understood her capabilities. She could no longer operate as a classified ghost. The transformation from anonymous operative to public figure was complete and irreversible. And while that limited her ability to conduct certain types of classified operations, it opened possibilities for something far more significant: the transformation of an entire generation's understanding of what disability meant in the context of military service and human capability. She'd been a weapon. Now she was something more dangerous. She was a symbol, and symbols, once activated in the public consciousness, could reshape the fundamental assumptions upon which societies operated. 6 months after the Yemen extraction, Sarah stood in a gymnasium full of wounded warriors. The San Diego Veterans Rehabilitation Facility's main exercise facility had been renovated with funding that appeared miraculous when announced, but was actually the result of 2 separate appropriations bills sponsored by senators who'd become convinced that adaptive warfare represented America's military future. The gymnasium now contained equipment designed for operators with every conceivable type of disability: spinal cord injuries, amputations, traumatic brain injuries, PTSD conditions, combinations of injuries that made conventional military service seem impossible. Sarah wasn't in her tactical wheelchair today. She transitioned to advanced prosthetics, cutting-edge technology that gave her remarkable mobility and allowed her to move through physical space in ways that more closely approximated her pre-injury capabilities. But today, she'd chosen to return to the wheelchair for this address. It was a deliberate choice, a visual statement about the nature of disability and capability that she wanted the audience to understand viscerally rather than intellectually. 243 wounded warriors sat in that gymnasium. Some were freshly injured, still processing the reality of their physical transformation. Others were veterans who'd spent years adapting to their disabilities, assuming their military service was permanently concluded. They ranged in age from 19 to 53 years old. They came from every military branch. They represented the physical and psychological complexity of modern combat injuries. And they were all watching Sarah Mitchell, with expressions that ranged from reverence to desperate hope. "You were told your service was over," Sarah said, her voice carrying through the gymnasium without amplification, trained decades ago to project authority across tactical distances. "The moment you received your injury diagnosis, the moment doctors explained the extent of your physical limitations, your command structure informed you that your operational days had ended. They gave you discharge papers. They offered you rehabilitation. They told you your greatest contribution to America's security had already been made." She paused, letting that statement settle into the room's consciousness. They were wrong. Sarah moved to the center of the gymnasium floor, rolling in the wheelchair with deliberate visibility. "Your country still needs you, not out of charity, not out of sentiment, not because we value your prior service and want to acknowledge it graciously. Your country needs you because capability doesn't disappear when your physical form transforms. It adapts. It evolves. It often becomes something far more extraordinary than what preceded the injury." She gestured to the renovated equipment surrounding them. 6 months ago, I led a tactical extraction operation in Yemen that extracted 4 American intelligence operatives from terrorist captivity. That operation violated conventional military doctrine because conventional doctrine was designed for operators with conventional physical capabilities. I could conduct that operation precisely because my disability forced a fundamental reimagining of what tactical capability could mean. My wheelchair wasn't a limitation I'd overcome. It was a tactical advantage that my enemies couldn't comprehend. A woman in the third row, probably early 30s, bilateral leg amputations, raised her hand. Sarah nodded for her to speak. "Commander, are you saying everyone here could potentially become a special operations operative?" "No," Sarah answered directly. "I'm saying something more important. I'm saying that the United States military has been operating under fundamentally incomplete assumptions about what capability means and where it comes from. We've assumed that certain types of military service require certain types of physical abilities. What I'm proposing is a comprehensive restructuring of how we think about military capability in the context of adaptive warfare." She brought up a presentation on the gymnasium's large display screens, the Adaptive Operations Program, a comprehensive initiative designed to identify wounded veterans with elite potential and redirect them into classified military roles perfectly suited to their capabilities. The program would involve 6 months of intensive evaluation and training. Participants would undergo psychological assessment, tactical skill evaluation, and specialized equipment testing. Those selected for operational deployment would become part of a newly formed unit, the Adaptive Response Squadron, designed specifically to conduct operations that exploited the unique capabilities that disabled operators possessed. "This isn't rehabilitation therapy," Sarah explained. "This is military assessment. Some of you will complete the program and determine that you're not cut out for this kind of work. That's perfectly valid. Some of you will complete the program and discover capabilities in yourselves that you never suspected existed. Some of you will find that your disability gives you advantages in specific operational contexts that fully able operators simply cannot match. And some of you will discover that you're built for something entirely new, something that didn't exist, until we recognized that military capability could take forms we'd never previously imagined." Over the next 4 hours, Sarah conducted detailed one-on-one assessments with volunteers from the gymnasium population. She evaluated physical capabilities, psychological resilience, tactical thinking patterns, decision-making processes under stress. She developed a proprietary assessment system that went far beyond traditional military fitness evaluations. She was looking for something specific: the combination of mental acuity, adaptability, operational mindset, and psychological resilience that separated extraordinary operators from merely competent soldiers. By the end of the assessment period, Sarah had identified 17 candidates who showed exceptional potential. Among them was Marcus Walker, a double amputee from the Iraq War who'd believed his military days were irretrievably behind him. Marcus had served in conventional infantry until an IED had taken both legs below the knee. Now, he was being offered the opportunity to undergo evaluation for the Adaptive Response Squadron, with the specific possibility of deployment in intelligence-gathering operations where his amputation actually provided tactical advantages. He could move through certain types of terrain more efficiently than operators with conventional prosthetics, and the psychological profile analysis suggested he had exceptional capability for high-stress decision-making. There was also Elena Rodriguez, a former pilot who'd experienced a traumatic brain injury that had ended her flying career. The injury affected certain types of processing, but had actually enhanced her pattern recognition capability and her ability to maintain focus across extended operational periods. Sarah identified her as potential for a specialized signals intelligence role, where her neurological adaptation created specific advantages. 34 additional wounded veterans expressed interest in the program beyond the initial 17 identified as exceptional. Sarah approved all of them for preliminary assessment. The program would expand iteratively, growing as more wounded warriors recognized that disability wasn't an ending but a transformation point. "This changes everything," Admiral Blackwell said when Sarah presented the program results to him in classified briefing a week later. "Not just military doctrine, not just special operations capability. You're fundamentally altering the national conversation about disability, capability, and the nature of human resilience. That's the point, Sarah replied. Military service has always been about individuals who are willing to sacrifice their physical wholeness for purposes larger than themselves. What I'm proposing is simply the recognition that sacrifice can take forms we hadn't previously acknowledged. A soldier who gives their legs for their country doesn't lose capability. They transform it. The question is whether we have the courage as a military institution to recognize that transformation as evolution rather than ending. By the end of the first year, the Adaptive Response Squadron had grown to 47 operatives. They'd conducted 17 classified operations across 6 continents. Their success rate exceeded 97%. They'd recovered intelligence assets, conducted extraction operations, gathered tactical information, and executed missions that conventional special operations teams would have classified as impossible. They'd done it while fundamentally changing the conversation about what military capability meant. Sarah spent part of her time in operational planning and part of her time as a mentor and instructor for the growing program. She worked with injured soldiers, helping them understand that their disability wasn't a punishment or an ending, but a transformation point toward something potentially more significant than what they'd lost. She trained operators in adaptive tactical techniques, in equipment systems designed for their specific capabilities, in psychological frameworks that treated disability as a strategic asset rather than a personal tragedy. The most profound moment came 8 months into the program, when Marcus Walker completed his first classified operation. It was a relatively low-risk intelligence-gathering mission in Southeast Asia, but it was his first deployment since losing his legs. When he returned and was debriefed by Sarah, he simply said, "I've spent the last 5 years convinced my life was over. I just realized my life was only beginning." Sarah understood that feeling. She'd experienced it the moment Admiral Blackwell had walked into her hospital room and given her a choice between permanent civilian retirement and one final mission. That moment had transformed her from ghost to legend. Now she was creating opportunities for other warriors to experience their own transformation, to recognize that the injuries they'd sustained weren't failures, but doorways to capabilities they'd never previously imagined. Standing in her office at the facility late one evening, looking at the growing file of Adaptive Response Squadron operatives, Sarah Mitchell understood that this legacy was more significant than any single military operation. Yemen had been extraordinary. Yemen had proven a concept, but the Adaptive Response Squadron represented the institutionalization of that concept, the transformation of exceptional individual capability into systemic military doctrine. The woman who'd been pitched from her wheelchair by an idealistic activist had become the architect of a new understanding of military capability. The disabled veteran that America had pitied had become the visionary who'd redefined what disability could mean in the context of human excellence. And the silent warrior in the rehabilitation facility had become the voice that changed how an entire nation understood resilience, sacrifice, and the infinite ways a person could serve purposes larger than themselves. The story of Sarah Mitchell wasn't a story about overcoming disability. It was a story about recognizing that disability, properly understood and strategically embraced, could transform an individual and ultimately transform institutions into something far more capable than what preceded the transformation. And somewhere in the future, beyond the visible horizon, new operatives from the Adaptive Response Squadron were preparing for missions that would reshape the landscape of what American military capability could accomplish. Sarah had opened a door that could never be closed. The question wasn't what disabled people could achieve despite their disabilities. The question was what humanity could achieve when it finally recognized that transformation created advantage.
Sì, esatto, è quello che ho visto anch'io. L'ho messo male? No, era giusto. Ok. Allora. Sì. Sì. Allora, se io adesso faccio così, loro non mi colpiscono e io lo posso portare sotto. No. Stai qui. Fermo qui. Io non posso... Oh, e questo?